The iron brand hisses against flesh, and the scream that follows echoes through the manufactorum's lower levels, where few are meant to hear. The symbol burns deep, an inverted aquila, wings folded downward in eternal shame. The branded man's name was Corvin Thaile, though that matters little now. What matters is the mark, and what the mark means, and the vast machinery of punishment that brought him to this moment. Thaler had been a metalworker in the northern foundries of Cadia, before Cadia fell, before the eye opened wider and swallowed half the segmentum, before the Departamento Munitorum's recruiters came with their quotas and their conscription scrolls, demanding bodies for the endless war. When they called his name, when they handed him the lasgun and the flak armor, and the Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer, he had done something that billions of others had done before him, something that billions would do after. He had said no, not loudly, not with speeches or manifestos or appeals to conscience. He had simply set down the weapon, removed the armor, and walked away. The Commissar had given him the regulation 3 chances to reconsider. Thale had refused each one with the same quiet certainty that had marked his metalwork, precise, deliberate, final. The branding is performed by a servo skull equipped with a thermal lance, its mechanical precision ensuring that every aquila inversa bears identical dimensions, identical depth, identical permanence. The skull's auger arrays record biometric data, cross-reference it with Munitorum files, update the central registry that tracks every soul who has chosen shame over service. This is not cruelty for its own sake. This is administrative necessity. Because the Imperium of Man encompasses 1,000,000 worlds and 10,000 years of war, and in all that time, across all that space, one truth has remained constant. There will always be those who refuse to fight. They are not aberrations. They are not anomalies. They are a predictable percentage of any population, as reliable as ore yields or atmospheric composition. The Munitorum's actuaries have calculated it precisely. For every 1,000 souls called to serve, 47 will refuse. The number varies by world, by culture, by the proximity of immediate threats, but it never reaches 0. This is the problem that created the solution branded into Thale's shoulder. This is the machinery that transforms refusal into utility, cowardice into resource, shame into service. The servo skull withdraws, its work complete. Thale slumps against the restraint harness, his consciousness flickering between pain and shock. But the process has only begun. The brand marks him as property of a different kind now. No longer a citizen who might serve, but a resource that will serve whether he chooses to or not. The aquila inversa is not just punishment. It is classification. Across the Imperium, in the deep archives of the Departamento, Munitorum, vast cogitator banks process millions of names, each attached to service records, psychological evaluations, genetic profiles, and potential utility assessments. Those who refuse initial conscription do not simply disappear into execution yards or punishment details. They flow into a parallel system, a shadow military infrastructure that has existed as long as the Imperial Guard itself. They become part of what the bureaucrats call, in their endless appetite for euphemism, the coward's tithe. The term appears in no official military doctrine, no published regulations, no speeches by Lord Generals or War Master proclamations. It exists in internal memoranda, in closed-session briefings, in the coded language that flows between commissariat offices, and penal world administrators, and the transport captains who ferry human cargo to places where names become numbers and individuals become statistics. The coward's tithe is not a punishment. It is a resource extraction system. Thale's brand still smokes when the Medici servitor applies the synth skin patch that will prevent infection, ensure proper healing, guarantee that the mark remains visible for the rest of his life, however long that might be. The servitor's work is gentle, almost tender. The Imperium has invested in this man now. He has value. He must be maintained. In 3 days he will be loaded onto a transport ship, bound for penal world designation, Kappa 77, where his refusal to fight will be processed into willingness through methods that have been refined over millennia of practice. In 6 months, if he survives the conditioning, he will be assigned to a penal battalion where his unwillingness to die for the Emperor will be transformed into an opportunity to die for the Emperor under circumstances that require no personal choice in the matter. But these are future calculations, administrative certainties that exist in files, and shipping manifests, and mortality projections. What exists now is the man, and the mark, and the slow understanding that his refusal has not freed him from service. It has simply changed the terms under which he will serve. The restraint harness releases with a pneumatic hiss. Thale staggers to his feet, his left arm hanging useless, his vision blurring from shock and pain medication. Through the manufactorum's grimy windows, he can see the recruitment lines still forming in the courtyard below. Young men and women waiting their turn to serve, to choose glory or shame, to accept the lasgun or face the brand. Most will choose the lasgun. The statistics guarantee it. But some will not, and for those few, the machinery of punishment waits with infinite patience and perfect efficiency. The Imperium wastes nothing, not even cowardice. Especially not cowardice. The door seals behind him with a final click, and Corvin Thaler begins the journey that will teach him what the Imperium truly does to those who will not fight. The recruitment courtyard, where Thale glimpsed those waiting souls, stretches across 17 acres of reinforced rockcrete, marked by orderly lines that snake between prefabricated processing stations. Each station bears the same imperial aquila, the same purity seals, the same motto etched in Gothic script: service is life, life is service. The machinery that brought Thale to his branding operates here in plain sight, its mechanisms as visible and unremarkable as the atmospheric processes that keep the air breathable. Every world in the Imperium must provide its tithe, not just of grain or minerals or manufactured goods, but of human lives. The Imperial Guard's endless appetite for soldiers demands constant feeding, and the Departamento Munitorum has calculated these requirements with the same precision they apply to ammunition stockpiles or fuel reserves. Cadia's northern provinces must provide 47,000 able-bodied recruits per Terran year. The quota is not negotiable. It is not adjusted for local conflicts, economic hardship, or population decline. It simply is. The processing stations are staffed by clerks whose families have served the Munitorum for generations, their knowledge of conscription protocols passed down like trade secrets. They know how to read the fear in a young recruit's eyes, how to identify the subtle signs of potential refusal before it hardens into actual disobedience. They know which questions reveal hidden doubts, which answers suggest problematic thinking, which hesitations require immediate commissariat attention. Station 7 processes agricultural workers from the grain collectives. Station 12 handles manufacturum labourers. Station 23 specializes in the children of former guardsmen, those who should know better than to refuse the honor of service. Each station maintains detailed records, not just of those who accept conscription, but of those who refuse it. Names, biometric data, family connections, reasons given for refusal. All of it flows upward through the administrative hierarchy, aggregated into reports that track refusal rates by sector, by social class, by genetic lineage. The commissariat maintains offices adjacent to each processing station. This is not coincidence. Commissar Valdez has overseen conscription on 17 worlds across 4 decades of service, and she understands that the threat of punishment must remain visible to maintain the consent of the majority. Her bolt pistol rests in its holster with ceremonial prominence, cleaned and polished to mirror brightness. She has never drawn it during a conscription drive. She has never needed to. Its presence is sufficient. But the weapon serves a secondary purpose that few recognize. It marks her as part of the system that will deal with those who refuse. When a potential recruit sees Commissar Valdez, when they note the bolt pistol and the purity seals and the skull-faced servo cherub that hovers at her shoulder, they understand that their choice extends beyond simple military service. They are choosing between willing compliance and involuntary processing. They are choosing between the honor of serving the Emperor and the shame of serving the Emperor under different terms. The statistics bear this out with mathematical certainty. On worlds where commissars maintain visible presence during conscription, refusal rates average 4.2%. On worlds where conscription proceeds without commissariat oversight, refusal rates climb to 7.8%. The difference represents thousands of lives per world, millions across the segmentum. Lives that remain in the regular Imperial Guard rather than flowing into the parallel system that processes refusal into utility. This parallel system requires its own infrastructure, its own shipping manifests, its own resource allocation. Transport ships designated for penal cargo operate on different schedules than those carrying regular recruits. Their holds are modified with reinforced bulkheads and additional security stations. Their crews receive hazard pay and mandatory loyalty screenings. Their destinations are not the training worlds where future guardsmen learn to march in formation and strip their weapons and die with dignity. They dock at processing facilities where refusal is systematically eliminated through methods that have been perfected over millennia of practice. The conscription machinery operates according to quotas that cascade down from segmentum command to sector administration to planetary governorships to local recruitment offices. Each level in the hierarchy receives targets expressed in precise numerical terms. 47,000 regular recruits, 2,200 penal candidates, 17 specialist technical conscripts with specific skill certifications. The numbers must balance. The quotas must be met. The machinery must be fed. Failure to meet quota triggers administrative reviews that can strip governorships, eliminate noble houses, or subject entire worlds to exterminatus sanctions. This is not theoretical. Archive records document 47 cases in the past century where worlds faced ultimate sanction for consistently failing to provide adequate tithes of human resources. The threat maintains compliance at every level of the hierarchy. Local recruitment officers understand this calculus intimately. They know that refusing citizens represent a different kind of resource, one that flows through different channels, but ultimately serves the same strategic requirements. A regular guardsman requires 6 months of training, standardized equipment, and ongoing logistical support. A penal legionnaire requires minimal conditioning, substandard equipment, and no expectation of survival beyond immediate tactical utility. The economic calculations favor the penal option in scenarios requiring large-scale attrition. This creates institutional incentives that operate below the level of official policy. Recruitment officers who consistently identify potential refusers before they formally refuse receive performance commendations. Commissars who maintain optimal ratios between willing compliance and involuntary processing earn assignment to prestigious positions. The system rewards efficiency in the conversion of refusal into utility. The machinery that branded Corvin Thaler extends far beyond the servo skull and the thermal lance. It encompasses the quotas that demanded his service, the processing stations that identified his unwillingness, the commissariat oversight that ensured his choice carried consequences, and the administrative networks that will transform his refusal into a different form of compliance. He believed he was choosing not to fight. The machinery understood he was choosing how to fight. This understanding permeates every level of the conscription system, from the clerks who process initial applications to the transport captains who ferry human cargo to the processing worlds. Individual choice exists within parameters established by institutional necessity. Citizens may choose service or refusal, but they cannot choose the consequences of refusal. Those consequences have been determined by requirements that transcend personal preference, calculated by authorities that view individual lives as components in vast strategic calculations. The conscription machinery operates with the same inexorable logic that governs all imperial institutions. The needs of the whole supersede the desires of the part, and refusal to acknowledge this logic does not exempt one from its operation. It simply changes the terms under which one experiences it. The logic that transformed Tharle's refusal into administrative processing operates according to classifications that have evolved over 10 millennia of imperial expansion. When the Departmental Munitorum's cogitators analyze his case file, when they cross-reference his biometric data with psychological profiles and family histories and genetic markers, they are not simply recording a name and a crime. They are determining which category of refusal he represents, and therefore which processing protocols will extract maximum utility from his unwillingness to serve. The classification system emerged from practical necessity during the Great Crusade, when the Emperor's armies encountered populations with radically different cultural attitudes toward warfare. Some peoples viewed combat as sacred duty. Others saw it as necessary evil. Still others refused it entirely on philosophical or religious grounds. The early imperial military command discovered that treating all refusers identically produced suboptimal results. Some could be converted through intimidation. Others required ideological reconditioning. Still others needed complete psychological reconstruction. Type Alpha refusal represents simple cowardice, the most common form and the most tractable. These individuals possess no ideological objection to imperial doctrine, no systematic resistance to military authority, no deep philosophical commitment to pacifism. They simply fear death more than they fear the consequences of refusing to risk death. The Munitorum's psychoanalysts estimate that 73% of all refusers fall into this category. Their processing requires minimal resources, basic conditioning, peer pressure, controlled exposure to combat scenarios under supervised conditions. Corvinthale's initial assessment places him in this category. His refusal contained no political speeches, no appeals to conscience, no references to alternative moral frameworks. He simply set down his weapon and walked away. The servo skull that branded him also performed genetic sampling, stress hormone analysis, and cranial measurement. The data suggests standard fear responses, elevated anxiety indicators, but no markers associated with systematic ideological deviation. Type Alpha refusers typically respond well to penal battalion assignment. The controlled environment eliminates personal choice while providing opportunities for redemptive action. Mortality rates average 87% across the first 3 combat deployments, but survivors often demonstrate acceptable enthusiasm for continued service. The fear that initially prevented voluntary enlistment becomes motivation for exceptional performance once alternative options have been eliminated. Type Beta refusal presents different challenges and different opportunities. These individuals reject military service based on ideological grounds, religious convictions that prohibit violence, political beliefs that question imperial authority, philosophical systems that prioritize individual conscience over collective necessity. They represent approximately 19% of all refusers, and their processing requires specialized intervention by ecclesiarchy personnel trained in theological correction. The case files contain detailed studies of Type Beta processing outcomes. Religious objectors can often be reconverted through intensive doctrinal education that reframes warfare as sacred duty rather than moral compromise. Political dissidents require more aggressive intervention, memory modification, personality reconstruction, implantation of artificial loyalty markers. The success rates vary significantly based on the strength of the underlying belief system and the skill of the processing teams. Type Beta refusers who successfully complete ideological reconditioning often become some of the most effective imperial servants. Their capacity for systematic thinking, once redirected toward appropriate targets, produces exceptional results. Several famous commissars began their careers as Type Beta refusers who underwent complete personality reconstruction. Their zealous commitment to imperial doctrine stems from artificial certainty implanted during processing. But the results serve imperial interests, regardless of their artificial origins. Type Gamma refusal occurs in fewer than 8% of cases, but these individuals present the greatest challenge and the greatest potential threat to imperial authority. They do not simply fear combat or question specific policies. They reject the fundamental assumptions that underlie imperial civilization. The necessity of endless war, the divine authority of the emperor, the subordination of individual will to collective purpose. They represent systematic resistance to the entire structure of imperial society. Processing Type Gamma refusers requires extreme methods that often destroy the individual while preserving useful biological components. Lobotomization, servitor conversion, and experimental surgical procedures that separate consciousness from motor function. The goal is not rehabilitation, but resource extraction, preserving physical capabilities while eliminating the consciousness that directed those capabilities toward resistance. The classification system operates with bureaucratic precision that masks its fundamental horror. Each type receives standardized processing protocols, documented procedures, statistical outcome tracking. The clerks who assign classifications work from detailed manuals that reduce human complexity to checkbox evaluations. Does the subject express religious objections? Checkbox Beta 7. Does the subject demonstrate systematic resistance to authority? Checkbox Gamma 3. Does the subject simply appear frightened? Checkbox Alpha 1. These classifications determine not just immediate processing, but long-term utility projections. Type Alpha refusers flow primarily into penal battalions, where their fear can be weaponized through controlled circumstances. Type Beta refusers undergo ideological reconstruction that can produce valuable assets for the commissaria or ecclesiarchy. Type Gamma refusers contribute biological resources to servitor production lines or experimental research programs. The system's efficiency depends on accurate initial classification. Misidentifying a type Gamma refuser as type Alpha can result in security breaches, escape attempts, or contamination of penal units with systematic resistance. Misidentifying a type Alpha refuser as type Gamma wastes resources on extreme processing methods when simple intimidation would suffice. The clerks who perform initial assessments receive extensive training in recognizing subtle markers that distinguish between categories. This training includes study of historical case files, psychological evaluation techniques, and practical exercises using condemned prisoners as test subjects. The clerks learn to identify micro-expressions that reveal hidden ideological commitments, verbal patterns that suggest systematic resistance, physiological responses that indicate authentic versus performed compliance. Their accuracy rates determine promotion opportunities, assignment preferences, and retirement. Benefits. The classification system transforms individual human decisions into administrative categories that enable systematic processing. Corvin Thales' refusal to accept his laser gun becomes classification Alpha 1, standard fear response, processing protocol 77 Alpha. His personal reasons, his individual circumstances, his unique history disappear into bureaucratic terminology that reduces his humanity to variables in established equations. But the system recognizes that individual cases sometimes resist clean categorization. Complex psychological profiles, mixed motivational factors, and unusual circumstances can blur the boundaries between types. For these exceptional cases, the Munitorum maintains specialized evaluation facilities staffed by experts trained in advanced psychological analysis and experimental processing techniques. These facilities operate according to protocols that push the boundaries of what remains recognizably human. The transport ship that will carry Thale to his processing destination maintains separate cargo holds for different classification types. Alpha refusers travel in standard restraint harnesses with basic life support. Beta refusers require isolation chambers that prevent ideological contamination between subjects. Gamma refusers undergo chemical sedation that maintains biological function while suppressing consciousness. The ship's crew understands that their cargo represents different forms of resource requiring different handling procedures. This systematic approach to processing refusal has evolved into one of the Imperium's most efficient resource conversion systems, It transforms individual resistance into collective compliance, personal choice into institutional utility, human complexity into administrative simplicity. The machinery that classified Corvin Thale operates with the same precision that governs ammunition production or fuel distribution. Individual components flow through standardized processes to produce predictable outputs that serve strategic requirements. The precision that reduces Corvin Thale to classification Alpha 1 requires human judgment to implement, and that judgment comes from Commissar Valdez and the thousands of officers like her who serve as the interface between administrative categories and individual lives. Her office occupies the third sub-level of the recruitment complex, reached through corridors lined with portraits of exemplary servants whose faces have been sanctified by glorious death in the Emperor's service. The portraits serve multiple purposes: inspiration for the faithful, warning for the doubtful, and reminder that service inevitably concludes with martyrdom. Valdez reviews Thal's file on a data slate whose screen flickers with the pale green luminescence of ancient cogitator technology. The information appears in standardized format: biometric readings, psychological evaluation scores, family history cross-references, genetic stability markers. But between these quantified assessments lies the space where human discretion operates, where 40 years of experience in processing refusal enables her to see patterns that escape algorithmic analysis. The preliminary classification suggests Alpha 1, but Valdez recognizes subtle indicators that warrant deeper investigation. Thaler's medical records show no history of anxiety disorders or phobic responses. His work evaluations from the northern foundries describe a methodical, reliable employee who completed dangerous tasks without hesitation. His refusal to accept conscription therefore represents a calculated decision rather than panic response, which could indicate beta-level ideological resistance disguised as simple cowardice. This distinction matters because processing protocols for alpha and beta classifications differ significantly in resource requirements, time investment, and expected outcomes. Misclassification wastes Imperial resources and produces suboptimal utility from processed subjects. Valdez's performance evaluations depend partly on her accuracy in making these determinations, but more importantly, the efficiency of the entire system relies on correct initial assessment. The commissariat training that prepared Valdez for this responsibility spans 3 years of intensive study at the Schola Progenium, followed by field apprenticeship under experienced officers, followed by psychological conditioning that eliminates personal squeamishness about necessary harshness. She learned to read micro-expressions that reveal hidden thoughts, verbal patterns that suggest forbidden beliefs, physiological responses that indicate authentic versus performed compliance. She studied historical case files of successful and failed processing attempts, learning to identify factors that predict different outcomes. But the training also prepared her for the personal costs of serving as the human interface in a system designed to break human resistance. The mortality rate among commissars exceeds that of frontline infantry officers, not from enemy action, but from psychological breakdown, substance abuse, and suicide. The constant exposure to human suffering, combined with the requirement to inflict such suffering systematically, destroys many officers who lack the emotional conditioning necessary for long-term service. Valdez has survived 4 decades in the commissariat, by developing what the training manuals call professional detachment, the ability to view individual human cases as components in larger strategic calculations. When she reviews Thyle's file, she does not see a frightened metalworker who made an understandable decision to avoid violent death. She sees a resource that requires proper classification to maximize Imperial utility. This psychological framework enables her to perform necessary functions without debilitating emotional interference. The evaluations process begins with standardized interrogation protocols designed to probe beneath surface responses and identify underlying motivational structures. Thale sits in a restraint chair whose sensors monitor heart rate, skin conductivity, neural activity, and hormonal fluctuations. These physiological measurements provide objective data to supplement his verbal responses, revealing involuntary reactions that conscious deception cannot control. Valdez begins with baseline questions designed to establish normal response patterns. Name, age, occupation, family status. Thale answers in steady tones that suggest controlled fear rather than panic or defiance. His physiological readings show elevated stress indicators, but no spikes that would indicate deception or systematic resistance. The preliminary assessment of Alpha-1 classification appears accurate, but Valdez probes deeper to eliminate uncertainty. Why did you refuse to serve? The question emerges in conversational tones that mask its tactical purpose. Thale's response will reveal whether his refusal stems from simple fear, ideological objection, or systematic resistance to imperial authority. His physiological readings shift as he considers his answer, showing increased neural activity that suggests complex decision-making rather than automatic response. I did not believe I would serve effectively in combat situations. The answer demonstrates careful consideration, suggesting intelligence and self-awareness that could indicate beta-level capacity for ideological reasoning. But the content focuses on personal inadequacy rather than moral objection, supporting the alpha classification. Valdez makes notations on her data slate while maintaining conversational eye contact that encourages continued communication. Do you object to others serving in combat situations? This question probes for ideological consistency that would suggest systematic pacifist beliefs rather than personal cowardice. Taylor's response comes more quickly, without the physiological indicators of complex reasoning that marked his previous answer. Number military service is necessary for imperial defense. I simply doubted my own capability. The response reinforces alpha classification while revealing no challenge to fundamental imperial doctrine. Thale accepts the necessity of warfare and the legitimacy of imperial authority. He simply excludes himself from personal participation based on perceived inadequacy rather than moral objection. Valdez continues the evaluation for 17 more minutes, probing potential areas of ideological deviation while monitoring physiological responses for indicators of deception or hidden resistance. The results confirm Alpha-1 classification with high confidence levels. Thale represents standard fear-based refusal that requires minimal processing resources and produces predictable outcomes under penal battalion protocols. But the evaluation process serves purposes beyond simple classification. It also begins the psychological conditioning that will prepare Thale for his new role as expendable resource in Imperial service. Each question reinforces the framework that defines his refusal as personal failure rather than principled stance. Each response that accepts imperial doctrine while excluding personal participation strengthens the cognitive dissonance that processing protocols will exploit to rebuild his psychology around different priorities. The final phase of evaluation involves presenting Thale with his processing options, framed as choices that restore some measure of personal agency, while directing him toward predetermined outcomes. He can accept assignment to a penal battalion with opportunities for redemptive service, or he can undergo enhanced processing that will eliminate his capacity for future refusal through surgical or chemical intervention. The choice is real within constrained parameters, but the parameters ensure that either option serves imperial requirements. Thale selects the penal battalion option, as Valdez predicted based on his psychological profile. The choice allows him to maintain some sense of personal dignity while accepting the consequences of his refusal. It also produces the outcome that imperial doctrine defines as optimal: conversion of unusable fear into useful tactical resource through controlled circumstances that eliminate personal choice while preserving combat capability. Valdez completes her evaluation report with the practiced efficiency of 4 decades' experience. Classification Alpha 1 confirmed. Processing Protocol 7-7 Alpha approved. Expected outcome: integration into penal battalion with acceptable probability of short-term combat utility. The report flows upward through administrative channels that will determine Thale's transport assignment, processing timeline, and ultimate tactical deployment. The human judgment that confirmed Thale's classification operates within systematic frameworks that minimize individual discretion while preserving the appearance of personal evaluation. Valdez believes she is making complex decisions about individual cases, but her training, her evaluation criteria, and her performance incentives all guide her toward predetermined outcomes that serve institutional requirements. The system allows sufficient flexibility to accommodate individual variation, while ensuring that such variation does not disrupt essential functions. This balance between human judgment and administrative necessity defines the commissariat's role in processing refusal. Officers like Valdez serve as the interface between individual human complexity and institutional simplicity, translating personal decisions into bureaucratic categories, while maintaining the psychological frameworks that enable systematic processing of human resistance. Their expertise lies not in understanding individual psychology, but in reducing individual psychology to manageable administrative components. The evaluation complete, Thale returns to his holding cell to await transport to the processing facilities that will transform his refusal into compliance through methods refined over millennia of practice. Valdez files her report and moves to the next case. Another individual whose personal choices must be evaluated, classified, and directed toward outcomes that serve requirements larger than personal preference. The machinery continues its operation with mechanical precision guided by human judgment that has been systematically shaped to serve mechanical purposes. The transport that carries Thale away from Commissar Valdez's evaluation chambers follows shipping routes that connect conscription centers to processing facilities across 17 subsectors, its holds filled with human cargo classified according to the same systematic precision that governs ammunition distribution or fuel allocation. The journey to penal world designation, Kappa 77, requires 43 days through the warp, 43 days during which Thale and 2,000 other Alpha-1 classifications experience their first taste of what the Imperium does to those who choose refusal over willing service. The holding cells aboard the transport maintain minimal life support, recycled air that carries the metallic taste of industrial filtration, protein paste dispensed at regulation intervals, waste disposal systems that process human biology with mechanical efficiency. But these conditions serve a purpose beyond simple economy. They begin the conditioning process that will prepare Alpha-1 refusers for integration into penal battalions, where survival depends on accepting circumstances beyond personal control. Thale shares his cell with 11 other men, whose brands mark them as fellow travelers in the machinery of punishment. They come from different worlds, different cultures, different circumstances. But the Aquila Inversa burned into their flesh creates a brotherhood of shared shame that transcends individual background. In whispered conversations during the sleep cycles, they share the stories that brought them to this transport. The moment of refusal, the evaluation process, the choice between penal service and enhanced processing that eliminated personal agency entirely. These conversations serve dual purposes that the transport's designers understood with clinical precision. They allow the prisoners to process their trauma through shared experience, preventing psychological breakdowns that would reduce their utility as expendable resources. But they also reinforce the cognitive framework that defines their refusal as personal failure rather than principled resistance, strengthening the shame that will motivate future compliance with orders they cannot refuse. Kappa 77 orbits a dying star whose radiation has stripped away most of the planet's atmosphere, leaving a world of deep canyon systems and underground facilities that house the processing infrastructure for 17 subsectors worth of refusers. The planet's surface appears from orbit as a geometric pattern of industrial scarring, mining operations, manufactorum complexes, and the vast detention compounds where individual resistance is systematically eliminated through methods that have been refined over 10 millennia of practice. The transport's approach reveals the scale of the operation that transforms refusal into utility. Shipping lanes crowded with cargo vessels, bringing in new prisoners and taking out processed resources. Orbital stations that sort incoming human cargo according to classification protocols. Defense platforms that prevent unauthorized departure while maintaining security against external threats. The entire system operates with the efficiency of an ammunition factory, processing human raw materials into finished products that serve Imperial tactical requirements. Thale's first glimpse of his new environment comes through the transport's viewing ports as they descend toward landing platform designation 17. The landscape below shows endless rows of prefabricated structures connected by transport networks that move people and resources according to schedules determined by processing requirements rather than human convenience. Steam rises from thermal vents that vent excess heat from the underground manufactorums, where prisoners work 16-hour shifts, producing equipment for the Imperial war machine. The landing procedure follows protocols designed to prevent escape attempts while maintaining processing efficiency. Prisoners disembark in groups of 50, their restraint harnesses linked to guide cables that direct movement toward intake facilities. Armed guards maintain perimeter security, but their primary function is psychological rather than tactical. Their presence reinforces the understanding that resistance will produce consequences worse than compliance. The intake facility processes new arrivals according to the same systematic precision that characterized their initial evaluation. Biometric scanning confirms identity and classification. Medical examination identifies health issues that could affect work assignment or processing timeline. Psychological evaluation determines readiness for integration into the general population versus need for preliminary conditioning. Each step reduces individual complexity to administrative data that enables efficient resource allocation. Thale receives assignment number 47-Alpha-1138, replacing his name with a designation that identifies his classification, processing batch, and individual sequence within that batch. The number will determine his housing assignment, work detail, food allocation, and ultimately his graduation pathway when processing concludes. Personal identity becomes administrative convenience, useful for record keeping, but irrelevant to the systematic transformation of refusal into compliance. The housing compound that becomes Thale's new residence operates according to social engineering principles developed through centuries of penal colony management. Overcrowding creates competition for basic resources, while preventing the formation of close personal bonds that might support organized resistance. Work assignments rotate frequently to prevent the development of specialized skills that could enable escape attempts. Recreation periods are scheduled to disrupt natural sleep cycles and maintain constant low-level stress that reduces complex thinking capability. But the compound also provides carefully controlled opportunities for positive reinforcement that support the conditioning process. Prisoners who demonstrate acceptable attitudes receive marginally better food allocations, preferred work assignments, and access to recreation facilities. These privileges create incentive structures that reward compliance while punishing resistance, gradually shifting individual psychology toward acceptance of institutional authority. The work assignments that fill Thale's days serve dual purposes that exemplify the efficiency with which the Imperium extracts utility from unwilling resources. The underground manufactorums produce equipment for Imperial Guard units, ammunition, rations, basic tools, and vehicle components. The prisoners' labor contributes directly to the war effort they refused to support through military service, creating ironic circularity that reinforces their status as Imperial resources regardless of personal preference. But the work also serves as conditioning mechanism that prepares Alpha 1 refusers for eventual integration into penal battalions. The 16-hour shifts teach acceptance of harsh conditions and rigid scheduling. The dangerous machinery eliminates those whose fear responses remain too strong for combat deployment. The productivity quotas create artificial unit cohesion as prisoners learn to cooperate for survival rather than individual advantage. Thale's assignment to Mining Detail 7 takes him into the deep excavation sites where prisoners extract rare minerals used in advanced Imperial technology. The work requires physical strength, tolerance for hazardous conditions, and ability to function as part of coordinated teams under extreme pressure. These same qualities will transfer directly to penal battalion service, where similar demands occur under combat conditions rather than industrial ones. The conditioning process operates through systematic erosion of individual will rather than dramatic reconstruction of personality. Each day's routine reinforces the framework that defines compliance as survival strategy and resistance as self-destructive behavior. Each interaction with guards, overseers, and fellow prisoners demonstrates that institutional power transcends personal preference. Each small concession to authority, accepting work assignments, following schedule requirements, consuming provided nutrition, strengthens the psychological pathways that will enable future acceptance of combat orders. Medical monitoring throughout the conditioning process tracks physiological and psychological markers that indicate readiness for graduation to penal battalion service. Stress hormone levels, sleep pattern analysis, cognitive function evaluation, and social interaction assessment provide objective data to supplement behavioral observation. Prisoners who maintain excessive fear responses receive extended conditioning until their psychology adapts to institutional requirements. The graduation criteria reflect the pragmatic calculations that govern all aspects of penal world operations. Prisoners must demonstrate acceptance of authority, ability to function under extreme stress, and willingness to risk personal safety for institutional objectives. They need not exhibit enthusiasm or ideological conversion. Simple compliance suffices for penal battalion deployment, where individual motivation matters less than systematic response to orders. Thale's conditioning proceeds according to statistical predictions that govern Alpha-1 processing outcomes. His fear responses gradually diminish as institutional authority becomes the dominant factor in his decision-making process. His individual identity merges with collective survival requirements as personal preference yields to group necessity. His refusal to fight transforms into readiness to fight under circumstances that eliminate personal choice while preserving combat utility. The machinery that processes Thaler, and thousands like him, operates with industrial efficiency that treats human psychology as raw material requiring systematic transformation. Individual resistance becomes collective compliance through methods that preserve useful capabilities while eliminating problematic autonomy. The system produces expendable soldiers who will fight not from courage or conviction, but from conditioning that has eliminated alternatives to compliance with orders they cannot refuse. The conditioning that transformed Thale's fear into compliance reaches its logical conclusion on processing day, when the industrial machinery of punishment delivers its finished product. Human beings who have been systematically reconstructed to serve imperial requirements they once refused to acknowledge. The ceremony occurs in Assembly Hall Designate Prime, a vast hangar-like structure where 5,000 processed refusers stand in perfect formation. Their individual personalities compressed into collective obedience through methods that have proven their efficiency across 10 millennia of implementation. Warden General Vex addresses the assembled masses from a raised platform, flanked by banners bearing the Aquila Inversa, the same symbol that brands each prisoner's flesh, now displayed as heraldry for the units they will join. His words carry the ceremonial weight of institutional transformation, marking the moment when Classification Alpha-1 becomes Designation Penal Legionnaire, when processed refusers become expendable soldiers in service to the throne they once rejected. "You have been found wanting in courage," Vex intones, his voice amplified through voxcasters that ensure every syllable reaches every ear. But the Emperor's mercy provides redemption through service, salvation through sacrifice, honor through death in his name. The formula has been refined through countless repetitions, its psychological impact measured and optimized to produce maximum motivational effect on audiences whose resistance has been systematically eliminated. The uniforms distributed to Penal Battalion, designation 7734-Alpha, carry the same aquila inversa that marks their wearer's flesh, but the fabric bears additional symbols that identify their specific role in Imperial military doctrine. Stormtrooper units receive red piping that designates assault formations. Engineer companies display crossed tools that mark them as specialists in obstacle clearance and fortification destruction. Medical orderlies wear green crosses that identify their function as expendable battlefield medics who treat wounded soldiers while drawing enemy fire. But beneath these ceremonial distinctions lies the fundamental truth that defines all Penal Legion service. These units exist to absorb casualties that would otherwise fall on regular Imperial Guard formations. Their tactical doctrine, their equipment allocation, their deployment patterns, and their life expectancy all reflect this essential function. They are human shields given weapons and orders, expendable resources deployed to achieve objectives through mass rather than skill. The equipment issued to Penal Battalion 7734-Alpha demonstrates this philosophy through systematic inadequacy that borders on deliberate sabotage. The laser guns are functional but built to minimum specifications with lower power outputs and higher failure rates than standard Imperial Guard weapons. The flak armor provides protection against shrapnel and small arms fire, but lacks the reinforcement systems that enable survival against heavy weapons. The communication equipment operates on frequencies that enemy forces have learned to track and target. This substandard equipment serves multiple purposes within the larger framework of Penal Legion deployment. It ensures that penal units cannot effectively challenge regular Imperial forces if discipline breaks down and they attempt rebellion. It maintains the economic efficiency that makes Penal Legions cost-effective compared to properly equipped regular formations. And it reinforces the psychological framework that defines penal service as punishment rather than privilege, maintaining the shame that motivates compliance with orders that lead inevitably to death. Thale receives his equipment with the same mechanical acceptance that marks all his interactions since processing began. The lasgun feels familiar in his hands, the weight distribution, the firing mechanism, the basic maintenance requirements, all standardized across Imperial military forces. But he recognizes the subtle differences that mark this weapon as expendable technology, designed for expendable users. The barrel shows stress fractures that will cause failure after sustained use. The power pack connections exhibit wear patterns that suggest multiple previous owners who no longer require their weapons. The tactical doctrine that will govern Thale's service as Penal Legionnaire 1138 reflects the strategic calculations that make penal units valuable, despite their low combat effectiveness. These formations excel in scenarios requiring mass casualties to achieve limited objectives, clearing minefields through human wave attacks, absorbing enemy fire to reveal hidden positions, conducting frontal assaults against fortified positions, where success depends on overwhelming numbers rather than tactical sophistication. Training for these missions focuses on basic competencies rather than advanced military skills. Penal legionnaires learn to follow simple orders under extreme stress, maintain formation discipline while under fire, and continue advancing despite massive casualties among their units. They do not receive training in complex tactics, advanced weapon systems, or leadership responsibilities that would enable independent action beyond immediate orders. The command structure imposed on penal battalions eliminates the possibility of autonomous decision-making that could threaten imperial control. Commissars embedded within each company maintain absolute authority over tactical decisions, disciplinary measures, and individual survival. These officers carry the same bolt pistols that oversee regular Imperial Guard units, but their rules of engagement authorize summary execution for any behavior that suggests insufficient enthusiasm for suicidal missions. Regular Imperial Guard officers assigned to penal battalion command positions receive hazard pay supplements and accelerated promotion opportunities that compensate for the psychological stress of leading expendable troops into certain death. These assignments are considered essential professional development for officers destined for high command positions, teaching them to view human lives as tactical resources rather than individual persons deserving preservation. The deployment patterns that will determine Thale's life expectancy follow statistical models developed through analysis of thousands of penal battalion engagements across multiple theaters of war. Average survival time for penal legionnaires in active combat zones measures 4.7 standard deployments, with significant variation based on mission type, enemy capabilities, and supporting Imperial forces. Units assigned to siege warfare typically survive 2.3 deployments. Those deployed in reconnaissance roles average 6.1 deployments before total casualty. Replacement becomes necessary. These statistics inform resource allocation decisions that treat penal battalions as consumable supplies rather than permanent military assets. Replacement personnel flow continuously from processing facilities to combat zones, maintaining unit strength at minimal cost while ensuring steady consumption of processed refusers. The system operates with the same efficiency that governs ammunition resupply or fuel distribution, treating human beings as components in larger logistical calculations. But the statistics also reveal the systematic waste that characterizes imperial military doctrine when applied to expendable forces. Penal battalions achieve their tactical objectives through methods that would be considered criminally negligent if applied to regular formations. Success rates for assigned missions average 67%, but unit survival rates for successful missions average only 23%. The Empire achieves its goals by accepting casualty rates that eliminate entire formations in exchange for limited territorial gains. The transportation that will carry Penal Battalion 7734 Alpha to its first combat assignment operates according to the same economic principles that govern all aspects of Penal Legion service. The troop ships lack the life support redundancies, medical facilities, and comfort amenities provided to regular Imperial Guard formations. Casualty rates during transport average 3.7% due to inadequate life support, overcrowding, and medical emergencies that receive minimal treatment resources. These transport conditions serve as final conditioning for the combat environment that awaits penal legionnaires upon arrival at their assigned theaters. The hardships, the overcrowding, the constant threat of death from system failures all prepare processed refusers for battlefield conditions, where similar threats will be augmented by enemy action designed to kill them as efficiently as possible. Thale boards, transport designation. Purgatory's Dawn, with assignment number 1138 stenciled on his uniform and equipment, his individual identity reduced to administrative convenience within a system that views him as expendable resource awaiting consumption in service to strategic objectives beyond his comprehension. The machinery that branded him as coward processed his refusal into compliance and equipped him for expendable service has completed its work with mechanical efficiency. The transformation is complete. Fear has become readiness to die on command. Refusal has become willingness to advance into certain death. Individual choice has become systematic obedience to orders that will determine when and how his life ends in service to the throne he once rejected. The penal legion option represents redemption through systematic expenditure of lives that were once deemed worthless but have been processed into tactical utility that serves Imperial requirements through methods that waste nothing. Not even cowardice, for Transport Purgatory's Dawn carries more than human cargo as it burns through the warp toward theater designation Hereticus Prime. It carries the concentrated calculations of Imperial logistics officers who have transformed individual human tragedies into statistical assets that serve strategic requirements. In the command quarters, sealed away from the penal legionnaires packed into cargo holds, Colonel Mordian reviews deployment projections that reduce Thale and his fellow processed refusers to numerical values in equations that balance resource expenditure against tactical gains. The data slates arrayed across Mordian's desk display the mathematical foundation that makes penal legion deployment economically viable within Imperial military doctrine. Training a standard Imperial Guardsman requires 6 months of instruction, standardized equipment worth 47 throne gelt per soldier, and ongoing logistical support that averages 12,000 throne gelt per month of active service. Processing a refuser into penal legionnaire status costs 8 throne gelt total, requires minimal equipment investment, and eliminates ongoing support requirements beyond basic ammunition resupply. These calculations assume average deployment survival rates that treat human death as acceptable cost rather than tragic outcome. Standard Imperial Guard formations suffer casualty rates averaging 23% per major engagement, requiring expensive replacement and retraining programs that strain military resources. Penal legions suffer casualty rates averaging 73% per major engagement, but replacement costs remain minimal because the processing facilities produce continuous streams of expendable personnel from the steady flow of refusers generated by conscription operations. The economic efficiency becomes more pronounced when measured against tactical utility in specific mission profiles. Clearing heavily mined approach routes requires either expensive engineering equipment and specialist personnel, or mass infantry deployment that accepts casualties to achieve objectives through human wave tactics. The engineering option costs approximately 340 throne gelt per cleared kilometer. The penal legion option costs 67 throne gelt per cleared kilometre, including casualty replacement and transport expenses. Similar calculations apply to assault missions against fortified positions, reconnaissance operations in hostile territory, and suppression campaigns that require occupation forces willing to accept guerrilla warfare casualties. In each scenario, penal legions provide cost-effective solutions to military problems that would otherwise strain Imperial resources or require postponement until adequate regular forces become available. The processed refusers enable Imperial commanders to pursue aggressive tactical options that regular formations cannot support. But the calculations extend beyond simple cost-benefit analysis to encompass broader strategic considerations that justify the systematic waste of human resources. Every penal legionnaire deployed in high-casualty operations represents one regular Imperial Guardsman preserved for missions requiring survival rather than expenditure. The mathematics of attrition warfare favor protecting valuable assets while consuming expendable ones, maximizing Imperial military effectiveness through systematic inequality in resource allocation. Colonel Mordian's mission briefings reveal how these calculations translate into operational planning that treats human life as tactical resource rather than moral consideration. The assault on Hereticus Prime requires penetration of defensive perimeters protected by extensive minefields, automated weapon systems, and prepared kill zones designed to inflict maximum casualties on attacking forces. Regular Imperial Guard formations would require months of preparation, specialized equipment, and accept casualty rates that could cripple entire regiments. The Penal Legion approach eliminates these constraints through systematic acceptance of casualties that regular commanders would consider catastrophic. 17 penal battalions will conduct frontal assaults against prepared positions, absorbing defensive fire while mapping enemy positions and exhausting ammunition supplies. Their deaths will provide tactical intelligence that enables follow-up attacks by regular formations operating with complete knowledge of enemy capabilities and defensive layouts. The operational timeline reflects this expendable approach through deployment schedules that assume unit destruction rather than unit preservation. Phase 1: Penal Legion assault to probe defenses and force enemy response. Phase 2: Artillery bombardment targeting positions revealed during Penal Legion attacks. Phase 3: Regular Imperial Guard assault against weakened defensive perimeters. The plan explicitly assumes that Phase 1 will consume all participating penal units while generating intelligence necessary for Phase 3 success. Transportation resources allocated to the operation demonstrate the systematic inequality that characterizes Imperial treatment of expendable versus valuable personnel. Regular Imperial Guard formations travel aboard ships equipped with medical facilities, recreational areas, and life support systems designed to maintain combat effectiveness during extended deployments. Penal legions travel in converted cargo vessels, whose holds have been modified to transport maximum personnel with minimal life support overhead. The supply calculations that determine equipment allocation for Operation Penitent Flame reflect similar economic logic applied to expendable human resources. Regular formations receive ammunition supplies calculated for extended engagements, medical equipment sufficient for casualty treatment and evacuation, and communication systems that enable coordination with supporting units. Penal formations receive basic ammunition loads, designed for single-use consumption, medical supplies limited to combat stimulants that maintain function until death, and communication equipment restricted to receiving orders rather than coordinating independent action. These resource disparities serve tactical purposes beyond simple economy. They ensure that penal units cannot effectively challenge regular Imperial forces if discipline breaks down during combat operations. They maintain the psychological framework that defines penal service as punishment rather than military assignment. And they reinforce the operational doctrine that treats penal legionnaires as weapons rather than soldiers, tools designed for single-use consumption in pursuit of strategic objectives. The intelligence assessments that inform tactical planning reveal enemy defensive capabilities that make Operation Penitent Flame effectively a suicide mission for participating penal units. Heretical forces controlling Hereticus Prime have established overlapping fields of fire that can destroy attacking formations before they reach effective weapon range. Automated defense systems can maintain continuous fire rates that exceed human survival capabilities. The fortress city's defensive perimeter has been designed specifically to inflict maximum casualties on Imperial assault forces. Regular Imperial commanders would classify such positions as requiring siege warfare, orbital bombardment, or bypass operations that avoid direct confrontation with prepared defenses. But the availability of expendable penal legions enables tactical options that treat human casualties as acceptable cost for achieving rapid results. The mathematics of expendability make frontal assault viable when human life carries no resource cost beyond initial processing investment. The operational orders distributed to penal battalion commanders reflect this systematic devaluation of human life through language that treats soldiers as ammunition rather than persons. Units will expend themselves against enemy positions. Personnel will be consumed achieving tactical objectives. Casualties will be accepted as operational requirements. The terminology transforms human death into administrative procedure, reducing individual tragedy to logistical calculation. Thale and his fellow penal legionnaires remain unaware of these calculations as their transport approaches Hereticus Prime's orbital space. They know only that they face combat deployment against enemy forces, redemption through service, and opportunities to prove their worth to the throne they once rejected. The machinery that processed their refusal into compliance has concealed the mathematical reality that their lives have been calculated as acceptable losses in equations that balance human expenditure against strategic gain. The economic logic that justifies their systematic expenditure operates beyond their comprehension, embedded in command structures and planning processes that treat individual human decisions as components in larger strategic calculations. Their personal choices, fear, refusal, eventual compliance, have been transformed into numerical values that enable tactical options unavailable to commanders, restricted by moral considerations about casualty rates and resource preservation. The transport's approach to combat deployment represents the final stage in a process that began with individual refusal and concludes with systematic expenditure of processed resources in service to strategic objectives that transcend personal preference. The machinery of punishment has completed its work with mathematical precision, delivering expendable personnel to combat zones where their deaths will serve Imperial requirements through methods that waste nothing. Not even cowardice, transformed into tactical utility through systematic processing of human resistance into collective compliance. The transport purgatory's dawn carries more than human cargo as it burns through the warp toward Theater Designation Hereticus Prime. It carries the concentrated calculations of Imperial logistics officers who have transformed individual human tragedies into statistical assets that serve strategic requirements. In the command quarters sealed away from the penal legionnaires packed into cargo holds, Colonel Mordian reviews deployment projections that reduce Thaler and his fellow processed refusers to numerical values in equations that balance resource expenditure against tactical gains. The data slates arrayed across Mordian's desk display the mathematical foundation that makes Penal Legion deployment economically viable within Imperial military doctrine. Training a standard Imperial Guardsman requires 6 months of instruction, standardized equipment worth 47 throne gelt per soldier, and ongoing logistical support that averages 12,000 throne gelt per month of active service. Processing a refuser into penal legionnaire status costs 8 throne gelt total, requires minimal equipment investment, and eliminates ongoing support requirements beyond basic ammunition resupply. These calculations assume average deployment survival rates that treat human death as acceptable cost rather than tragic outcome. Standard Imperial Guard formations suffer casualty rates averaging 23% per major engagement, requiring expensive replacement and retraining programs that strain military resources. Penal legions suffer casualty rates averaging 73% per major engagement, but replacement costs remain minimal because the processing facilities produce continuous streams of expendable personnel from the steady flow of refusers generated by conscription operations. The economic efficiency becomes more pronounced when measured against tactical utility in specific mission profiles. Clearing heavily mined approach routes requires either expensive engineering equipment and specialist personnel or mass infantry deployment that accepts casualties to achieve objectives through human wave tactics. The engineering option costs approximately 340 throne gelt per cleared kilometer. The Penal Legion option costs 67 throne gelt per cleared kilometer, including casualty replacement and transport expenses. Similar calculations apply to assault missions against fortified positions, reconnaissance operations in hostile territory, and suppression campaigns that require occupation forces willing to accept guerrilla warfare casualties. In each scenario, penal legions provide cost-effective solutions to military problems that would otherwise strain Imperial resources or require postponement until adequate regular forces become available. The processed refusers enable Imperial commanders to pursue aggressive tactical options that regular formations cannot support. But the calculations extend beyond simple cost-benefit analysis to encompass broader strategic considerations that justify the systematic waste of human resources. Every penal legionnaire deployed in high-casualty operations represents one regular Imperial Guardsman preserved for missions requiring survival rather than expenditure. The mathematics of attrition warfare favor protecting valuable assets while consuming expendable ones, maximizing Imperial military effectiveness through systematic inequality in resource allocation. Colonel Mordian's mission briefings reveal how these calculations translate into operational planning that treats human life as tactical resource rather than moral consideration. The assault on Hereticus Prime requires penetration of defensive perimeters protected by extensive minefields, automated weapon systems, and prepared kill zones designed to inflict maximum casualties on attacking forces. Regular Imperial Guard formations would require months of preparation, specialized equipment, and accept casualty rates that could cripple entire regiments. The Penal Legion approach eliminates these constraints through systematic acceptance of casualties that regular commanders would consider catastrophic. 17 penal battalions will conduct frontal assaults against prepared positions, absorbing defensive fire while mapping enemy positions and exhausting ammunition supplies. Their deaths will provide tactical intelligence that enables follow-up attacks by regular formations, operating with complete knowledge of enemy capabilities and defensive layouts. The operational timeline reflects this expendable approach through deployment schedules that assume unit destruction rather than unit preservation. Phase 1. Penal Legion assault to probe defenses and force enemy response. Phase 2. Artillery bombardment targeting positions revealed during Penal Legion attacks. Phase 3. Regular Imperial Guard assault against weakened defensive perimeters. The plan explicitly assumes that Phase 1 will consume all participating penal units, while generating intelligence necessary for Phase 3 success. Transportation resources allocated to the operation demonstrate the systematic inequality that characterizes Imperial treatment of expendable versus valuable personnel. Regular Imperial Guard formations travel aboard ships equipped with medical facilities, recreational areas, and life support systems designed to maintain combat effectiveness during extended deployments. Penal legions travel in converted cargo vessels, whose holds have been modified to transport maximum personnel with minimal life support overhead. The supply calculations that determine equipment allocation for Operation Penitent Flame reflect similar economic logic applied to expendable human resources. Regular formations receive ammunition supplies calculated for extended engagements, medical equipment sufficient for casualty treatment and evacuation, and communication systems that enable coordination with supporting units. Penal formations receive basic ammunition loads designed for single-use consumption, medical supplies limited to combat stimulants that maintain function until death, and communication equipment restricted to receiving orders rather than coordinating independent action. These resource disparities serve tactical purposes beyond simple economy. They ensure that penal units cannot effectively challenge regular Imperial forces if discipline breaks down during combat operations. They maintain the psychological framework that defines penal service as punishment rather than military assignment. And they reinforce the operational doctrine that treats penal legionnaires as weapons rather than soldiers, tools designed for single-use consumption in pursuit of strategic objectives. The intelligence assessments that inform tactical planning reveal enemy defensive capabilities that make Operation Penitent Flame effectively a suicide mission for participating penal units. Heretical forces controlling Hereticus Prime have established overlapping fields of fire that can destroy attacking formations before they reach effective weapon range. Automated defense systems can maintain continuous fire rates that exceed human survival capabilities. The fortress city's defensive perimeter has been designed specifically to inflict maximum casualties on Imperial assault forces. Regular Imperial commanders would classify such positions as requiring siege warfare, orbital bombardment, or bypass operations that avoid direct confrontation with prepared defenses. But the availability of expendable penal legions enables tactical options that treat human casualties as acceptable cost for achieving rapid results. The mathematics of expendability make frontal assault viable when human life carries no resource cost beyond initial processing investment. The operational orders distributed to penal battalion commanders reflect this systematic devaluation of human life through language that treats soldiers as ammunition rather than persons. Units will expend themselves against enemy positions. Personnel will be consumed achieving tactical objectives. Casualties will be accepted as operational requirements. The terminology transforms human death into administrative procedure, reducing individual tragedy to logistical calculation. Thale and his fellow penal legionnaires remain unaware of these calculations as their transport approaches Hereticus Prime's orbital space. They know only that they face combat deployment against enemy forces, redemption through service, and opportunities to prove their worth to the throne they once rejected. The machinery that processed their refusal into compliance has concealed the mathematical reality that their lives have been calculated as acceptable losses in equations that balance human expenditure against strategic gain. The economic logic that justifies their systematic expenditure operates beyond their comprehension, embedded in command structures and planning processes that treat individual human decisions as components in larger strategic calculations. Their personal choices, fear, refusal, eventual compliance, have been transformed into numerical values that enable tactical options unavailable to commanders restricted by moral considerations about casualty rates and resource preservation. The transport's approach to combat deployment represents the final stage in a process that began with individual refusal and concludes with systematic expenditure of processed resources in service to strategic objectives that transcend personal preference. The machinery of punishment has completed its work with mathematical precision, delivering expendable personnel to combat zones where their deaths will serve Imperial requirements through methods that waste nothing, not even cowardice transformed into tactical utility through systematic processing of human resistance into collective compliance. The medical station's harsh illumination reveals wounds that will require standard healing time rather than the immediate death that operational planners calculated as the most probable outcome for Penal Legionnaire 1138. The Medicae Servitor that tends Thale's injuries operates with mechanical efficiency, designed for rapid throughput rather than comprehensive care. Its augmetic appendages programmed to restore minimum combat effectiveness rather than full health recovery. The Emperor's mercy extends to preserving useful resources, but only insofar as those resources maintain tactical utility. Across 17 similar medical facilities scattered throughout the conquered territory, the surviving remnants of Operation Penitent Flame receive treatment that reflects their status as expendable personnel, whose continued existence represents statistical anomaly rather than planned outcome. Of the 50,000 penal legionnaires who participated in the assault, Fewer than 3,000 survive with wounds compatible with future deployment. The casualty rate of 94% falls within acceptable parameters established by operational planners who designed the mission around systematic expenditure of processed refusers. The accounting procedures that quantify Operation Penitent Flame's success operate according to mathematical frameworks that treat human death as acceptable cost rather than tragic outcome. Colonel Mordian's preliminary reports reduce individual human experiences to statistical categories. 47,000 personnel expended, 2,847 personnel requiring medical processing, 153 personnel suitable for immediate reassignment. The terminology transforms systematic slaughter into administrative procedure, individual tragedy into logistical calculation. But the reports also reveal the tactical effectiveness that justifies systematic expenditure of expendable human resources in pursuit of strategic objectives. Enemy defensive positions that resisted orbital bombardment and regular assault formations collapsed within 18 hours of Penal Legion contact. Fortress City defensive perimeters that intelligence services estimated would require months of siege warfare fell to direct assault supported by systematic application of expendable personnel. The mathematics of success favor approaches that accept human casualties as operational overhead. The interrogation facilities where captured enemy personnel undergo processing provide additional evidence of Operation Penitent Flame's strategic value beyond simple territorial acquisition. Heretical forces defending Hereticus Prime possessed weapons technology, defensive capabilities, and tactical doctrine that posed significant threats to regular Imperial formations. Their systematic defeat through Penal Legion assault eliminates enemy assets while providing intelligence that enhances Imperial military effectiveness across multiple theaters of operation. These intelligence gains justify resource expenditure that appears wasteful when measured purely through casualty statistics. The weapons analysis conducted on captured enemy equipment reveals defensive systems capable of inflicting severe casualties on regular Imperial Guard formations. The tactical assessments based on prisoner interrogation identify strategic weaknesses that enable more efficient approaches to similar defensive positions. The operational lessons learned through systematic expenditure of penal legions enhance Imperial military doctrine in ways that preserve valuable regular formations during future engagements. The logistical calculations that measure Operation Penitent Flame's economic efficiency demonstrate the mathematical foundations that make systematic expenditure of processed refusers strategically viable. Standard siege warfare against prepared defensive positions requires specialized equipment, extended timelines, and casualty rates that can destroy entire regular formations. The Penal Legion approach achieves identical objectives through systematic application of expendable personnel whose processing costs represent minimal investment compared to equipment and training expenses. Transportation resources recovered from the operation illustrate the systematic inequality that characterizes Imperial treatment of different personnel categories. Regular Imperial Guard formations evacuate casualties aboard medical transports equipped with surgical facilities, life support systems, and medical personnel trained in trauma treatment. Penal Legion survivors travel in converted cargo vessels whose medical facilities consist of automated healing stations designed for rapid processing rather than comprehensive care. The medical evaluation procedures that determine survivor reassignment operate according to classification systems that reduce individual human complexity to administrative categories. Category 1. Personnel suitable for immediate combat reassignment with minimal medical intervention. Category 2. Personnel requiring extended treatment before return to active duty. Category 3. Personnel whose injuries preclude further combat service but permit assignment to support roles. Category 4. Personnel whose injuries require medical termination to prevent resource waste. Thale's evaluation places him in Category 2, requiring 6 weeks of treatment before reassignment to new penal formation. The medical servitor's assessment focuses on functional capability rather than individual comfort, measuring his utility as expendable resource rather than his condition as human being. His survival represents statistical anomaly that provides opportunities for extended service rather than achievement worthy of recognition or reward. The replacement procedures that restore penal battalion strength to operational levels demonstrate the systematic nature of Imperial resource management applied to expendable personnel. Processing facilities across 17 subsectors receive requisitions for specific quantities of Alpha-1 classifications to replace casualties from Operation Penitent Flame. The numbers flow through administrative channels with the same precision that governs ammunition, resupply, or fuel distribution, treating human beings as consumable resources requiring regular replacement. New transport ships arrive at Hereticus Prime, carrying fresh loads of processed refusers, whose conditioning has prepared them for integration into reconstituted penal formations. These replacements undergo identical procedures that transformed Thale from individual refusing service to expendable resource accepting systematic expenditure. The machinery of punishment operates with continuous efficiency, processing individual resistance into collective compliance through methods that ensure steady supply of expendable personnel for future operations. The promotion opportunities that reward Imperial officers for successful Penal Legion operations reflect the systematic devaluation of expendable human life within military career advancement structures. Colonel Mordian receives commendation for achieving tactical objectives with minimal regular formation casualties, his professional success measured by preservation of valuable resources rather than expenditure of expendable ones. The mathematical frameworks that justify systematic waste also create incentive structures that reward officers who implement such waste efficiently. The operational reports that document lessons learned from Operation Penitent Flame establish precedents for future deployment of expendable personnel in similar tactical situations. The procedures that proved effective, frontal assault with systematic casualty acceptance, intelligence gathering through personnel expenditure, follow-up operations by regular formations using intelligence purchased through Penal Legion deaths, become standardized doctrine applied across multiple theaters of Imperial military operation. But these reports also reveal the systematic contradictions that characterize Imperial treatment of processed refusers. The individuals whose initial refusal to serve prompted their classification as cowards demonstrated exceptional courage during combat operations that required advancing into certain death. Their systematic expenditure eliminates precisely the human qualities that Imperial doctrine claims to value. Willingness to sacrifice personal safety for collective objectives, acceptance of death in service to higher authority, loyalty to Imperial institutions despite personal cost. The administrative procedures that process Operation Penitent Flame's aftermath operate with mechanical precision that treats individual human decisions as components in larger strategic calculations. Casualty reports flow upward through command hierarchies that aggregate individual deaths into statistical summaries. Resource requisitions ensure continuous replacement of expended personnel through processing facilities that transform refusal into compliance. Medical evaluation determines optimal use of surviving resources through classification systems that reduce human complexity to administrative categories. The machinery that transformed Thyla from individual refusing service to expendable resource, accepting systematic expenditure, continues operating through accounting procedures that measure success through objective achievement rather than human cost. His survival represents statistical anomaly within systems designed around assumption of total personnel expenditure. His continued existence creating administrative complications rather than individual achievement. The redemption promised through penal legion service operates according to mathematical frameworks that treat human death as preferred outcome, individual survival as exceptional circumstance requiring special processing. The statistical anomaly that is Thyla's survival creates administrative complications that reveal the fundamental contradiction embedded within Imperial promises of redemption through penal service. The medical facility's data, terminals display his case file with the same clinical precision that once classified his refusal, but now the categories must account for an outcome the system did not anticipate. A processed refuser who fulfilled his tactical function and lived to require further classification. The medical servitor completes its assessment with mechanical indifference to the implications of its findings. Thale's injuries will heal within acceptable parameters. His psychological conditioning remains intact despite exposure to combat trauma that typically produces system breakdown. His physical capabilities meet minimum standards for continued expendable deployment. But these positive indicators create a problem that the administrative machinery struggles to process. What happens to penal legionnaires who achieve the redemption supposedly offered through systematic expenditure? Rehabilitation Officer Gren reviews Thale's case with the practiced efficiency of someone who has processed thousands of similar files over 3 decades of service in the Penal Legion system. Her data slate displays redemption statistics compiled across 17 subsectors, 47 years, and 1.3 million individual cases of processed refusers deployed in expendable operations. The numbers reveal truths that Imperial doctrine conceals behind spiritual rhetoric about salvation through sacrifice. Of the 1.3 million penal legionnaires deployed during the statistical period, 47,234 survived their initial combat assignments, with wounds compatible with continued service. This represents a survival rate of 3.6%, falling within normal parameters for expendable personnel operations. Of these survivors, 31,847 received medical treatment and reassignment to new penal formations, where they faced identical tactical deployment designed around systematic expenditure. The machinery operates with predictable efficiency, consuming resources through repeated application rather than single-use disposal. But the statistics reveal deeper patterns that expose the systematic deception embedded within promises of redemption through penal service. Of the 47,234 initial survivors, only 2,891 lived through second combat deployments. Of these, 187 survived third deployments, 14 individuals survived fourth deployments, and statistical records indicate that no penal legionnaire in the 47-year sample period survived beyond a fifth combat assignment. These numbers demonstrate mathematical impossibility embedded within Imperial, promises that frame penal service as pathway to redemption rather than systematic method of delayed execution. The doctrine suggests that exceptional performance in combat can earn restoration to regular Imperial Guard status, return to civilian life, or other forms of redemption that reward courage displayed under impossible circumstances. The statistical reality reveals that such redemption occurs in fewer than 0.3% of all cases, making it effectively non-existent despite official policy statements. Officer Gren's assessment of Thales' redemption prospects operates according to classification protocols that reduce individual human achievement to administrative procedure. His survival of Operation Penitent Flame demonstrates successful conditioning rather than exceptional performance. His wounds indicate acceptable resilience for continued expendable deployment. His psychological evaluation shows no markers suggesting unsuitability for repeated systematic expenditure in pursuit of tactical objectives. The rehabilitation process that prepares Penal Legion survivors for reassignment operates according to systematic deception that maintains psychological frameworks necessary for continued compliance. Medical treatment focuses on physical restoration while reinforcing cognitive structures that define survival as opportunity for future service rather than achievement worthy of reward. Counseling sessions emphasize the spiritual value of continued sacrifice while concealing statistical realities that make genuine redemption mathematically impossible. The few documented cases of actual redemption from Penal Legion service reveal exception protocols that prove the rule through their extraordinary rarity. Imperial records identify 17 individuals across the 47-year sample period who earned restoration to regular Imperial Guard status through exceptional service in expendable operations. Each case required specific authorization from Sector Command, extensive background verification, and psychological reconstruction that eliminated memories of penal processing to prevent contamination of regular formations with expendable personnel experiences. But detailed analysis of these exceptional cases reveals systematic manipulation that maintains the illusion of possible redemption while ensuring its practical impossibility. The individuals selected for redemption demonstrated psychological profiles suggesting potential value as regular Imperial Guard personnel. But their selection occurred before penal deployment, rather than as a result of exceptional performance. Their apparent redemption through service actually represented predetermined administrative procedures disguised as reward for individual achievement. The case of former Penal Legionnaire Vex illustrates this systematic deception through documented administrative procedures that transformed statistical manipulation into propaganda narrative. Vex survived 4 combat deployments, while demonstrating tactical capabilities that exceeded standard Penal Legion expectations. Official records credit his redemption to exceptional courage and loyalty displayed under impossible circumstances. Classified administrative files reveal that his psychological profile identified him as suitable for intelligence services before his initial penal deployment. Vex's apparent redemption through exceptional service actually represented planned extraction of useful intelligence asset, whose initial classification as expendable personnel served cover requirements for deep infiltration operations. His Penal Legion service provided authentic background for subsequent assignment to intelligence roles requiring credible criminal history. The redemption narrative concealed systematic manipulation behind spiritual rhetoric about salvation through sacrifice. Similar analysis of other documented redemption cases reveals identical patterns of predetermined administrative procedures disguised as reward for individual achievement. The Imperial machinery maintains statistical records of redemption rates to support doctrinal claims about salvation through service. But these statistics represent systematic deception rather than authentic outcomes. The 0.3% redemption rate serves psychological manipulation rather than genuine opportunity for processed refusers. The administrative procedures that determine Thale's future deployment operate according to these systematic deceptions while maintaining bureaucratic efficiency that treats individual human decisions as components in larger strategic calculations. His survival creates opportunities for extended service rather than pathway to redemption. His continued utility measured against mathematical projections that predict eventual expenditure regardless of individual performance or achievement. The medical rehabilitation that prepares him for reassignment reinforces psychological frameworks that define survival as privilege requiring gratitude rather than achievement deserving recognition. The conditioning that eliminated his initial refusal operates through systematic concealment of statistical realities that make genuine redemption impossible, while maintaining hope that motivates continued compliance with orders leading inevitably to death. The reassignment procedures that will determine his next deployment operate according to resource allocation principles that treat surviving penal legionnaires as experienced expendable personnel whose conditioning has been validated through combat exposure. Such individuals require minimal additional processing before deployment in operations requiring systematic expenditure of human resources in pursuit of tactical objectives that regular formations cannot achieve through conventional methods. Thale's case file receives the standard classification that marks him for reassignment to Penal Battalion designation 4471-Beta, currently forming for deployment in Theater designation Mortis 7, where enemy defensive capabilities require systematic application of expendable personnel through frontal assault tactics. The deployment represents continued service in fulfillment of his redemption pathway. Systematic expenditure disguised as spiritual opportunity through administrative procedures that maintain institutional efficiency while concealing mathematical impossibility of genuine redemption. The machinery that transformed his initial refusal into systematic compliance continues operating through medical procedures that restore his utility as expendable resource, administrative processes that disguise repeated expenditure as progressive redemption and psychological conditioning that maintains hope despite statistical certainties that predict eventual death through systematic deployment in operations designed around acceptable casualty rates exceeding 90% per engagement. The promise of redemption through service operates as psychological weapon rather than genuine opportunity, maintaining compliance among expendable personnel whose systematic expenditure serves Imperial tactical requirements through methods that waste nothing, not even the hope that motivates continued service despite mathematical impossibility of survival beyond limited number of combat deployments designed around assumption of total personnel expenditure. The reassignment procedures that prepare Thale for deployment with Penal Battalion 4471-Beta include mandatory spiritual conditioning administered by Chaplain Mortius, whose scarred features and augmetic throat implant mark him as a veteran of the same systematic expenditure that awaits his charges. The chapel where these sessions occur bears the familiar iconography of imperial faith, skulls wreathed in golden light, angels wielding flaming swords, the emperor's visage gazing down in eternal judgment. But the sermons delivered here serve functions that transcend simple religious instruction. Mortius speaks in the mechanical cadence imposed by his throat augmetic, each word precisely modulated to achieve maximum psychological impact on audiences whose resistance has been systematically eliminated through processing. Your refusal to serve marked you as spiritually deficient, he intones, his artificial voice carrying harmonics designed to induce psychological submission. But the Emperor's mercy provides opportunity for redemption through suffering, salvation through sacrifice, purification through death in his name. The theological framework that transforms individual cowardice into spiritual failing operates according to doctrinal principles developed over 10 millennia of imperial expansion across cultures with radically different concepts of courage, duty, and religious obligation. The imperial cult absorbed and systematized these diverse belief systems into unified doctrine that frames military service as sacred duty, refusal of service as heretical deviation, and systematic expenditure of refusers as spiritually necessary correction of moral failure. The chapel's acoustics amplify Mortius's words through sonic enhancement systems that bypass conscious thought to implant psychological associations directly into the neural pathways that govern emotional response. The processed refusers who attend these mandatory sessions experience guilt, shame, and spiritual yearning as conditioned responses rather than authentic emotions, their psychology systematically modified to accept systematic expenditure as deserved punishment rather than institutional cruelty. The doctrinal texts that provide scriptural foundation for this spiritual manipulation draw from the same theological traditions that justify the entire imperial system: the divine authority of the emperor, the sacred nature of human sacrifice in service to higher purpose, the spiritual pollution that results from refusing collective obligation. These concepts transform individual human decisions into cosmic moral categories, elevating administrative procedures to the level of religious sacrament. Thale absorbs these lessons with the mechanical acceptance that characterizes all his responses since processing began. The conditioning that eliminated his capacity for independent moral judgment operates perfectly, allowing spiritual manipulation to proceed without interference from rational analysis or ethical evaluation. His guilt over his initial refusal becomes foundation for accepting systematic expenditure as appropriate consequence rather than questioning the system that defines human beings as expendable resources. The psychological techniques that transform processed refusers into willing participants in their own systematic expenditure rely on theological concepts that reframe victimization as spiritual opportunity. Chaplain Mortius explains that their suffering serves the Emperor's greater purpose, their deaths purchasing redemption not just for themselves, but for the families and communities they abandoned through their initial cowardice. The doctrine transforms systematic waste into cosmic necessity, individual tragedy into universal benefit. These spiritual frameworks operate through systematic inversion of traditional moral categories that define protection of innocent life as virtuous and unnecessary suffering as evil. Imperial doctrine redefines unnecessary suffering as spiritually beneficial, systematic expenditure of human life as morally required, and institutional cruelty as divine justice. The inversion enables processed refusers to participate enthusiastically in their own destruction while believing they serve righteous cause. The confession rituals that conclude each spiritual conditioning session require processed refusers to verbally acknowledge their moral failings while expressing gratitude for opportunities to achieve redemption through systematic expenditure. These verbal commitments strengthen psychological conditioning by forcing individuals to participate actively in their own manipulation, creating cognitive dissonance that reinforces compliance with institutional authority. Thele recites the prescribed formulas with practiced precision. I confess my cowardice and spiritual weakness. I accept the Emperor's mercy through opportunity for redemptive service. I embrace suffering as pathway to salvation, death as gateway to honor. The words flow automatically, his conditioned responses operating independently of conscious thought or authentic emotional engagement. But the spiritual conditioning extends beyond individual psychology to encompass broader social frameworks that justify systematic expenditure of processed refusers as necessary component of imperial civilization. The doctrine teaches that society requires examples of punishment to maintain collective discipline, that individual suffering serves educational purposes for others who might consider similar refusal, and that systematic waste of human life demonstrates imperial power to all who would challenge institutional authority. The theological justifications for these systematic cruelties draw from imperial history interpreted through doctrinal frameworks that transform 10 millennia of warfare into sacred narrative. The Emperor's sacrifice during the Horus heresy becomes model for all subsequent human sacrifice in imperial service. The suffering of loyal servants throughout imperial history becomes precedent justifying continued suffering in present circumstances. The systematic waste of human resources becomes spiritual tradition rather than administrative failure. The educational materials provided to processed refusers reinforce these theological frameworks through carefully selected historical examples that demonstrate spiritual value of systematic expenditure. The stories focus on individuals who achieved posthumous recognition through exceptional suffering in imperial service. Their deaths transformed into inspirational narratives that encourage similar acceptance of systematic expenditure among current audiences. These inspirational narratives operate through systematic omission of statistical realities that reveal the mathematical impossibility of achieving similar recognition. The stories emphasize exceptional cases while concealing the millions of processed refusers whose deaths provided no inspiration, achieved no recognition, and served no purpose beyond fulfilling tactical requirements for expendable personnel in operations designed around systematic waste of human resources. The psychological manipulation embedded within these spiritual conditioning programs operates according to systematic understanding of human cognitive limitations and emotional vulnerabilities. The processed refusers who attend mandatory sessions lack the intellectual resources necessary to analyze doctrinal claims critically, their educational backgrounds, and mental conditioning, combining to prevent rational evaluation of theological assertions about spiritual value of systematic expenditure. The chaplains who administer spiritual conditioning receive specialized training in psychological manipulation techniques disguised as religious instruction. They study cognitive science, behavior modification theory, and mass psychology, in addition to traditional theological education. Their expertise lies not in authentic spiritual guidance, but in systematic application of religious concepts to achieve institutional objectives that require willing compliance with systematic expenditure. Chaplain Morteus represents the culmination of this specialized training through his own history as processed refuser who underwent complete psychological reconstruction before assignment to chaplain duties. His augmetic throat implant conceals not combat injuries, but surgical modifications that eliminated his capacity for independent moral judgment, while preserving his ability to manipulate others through systematic application of spiritual authority. The irony embedded within this system operates below the level of conscious recognition for both chaplains and their audiences. The individuals who administer spiritual conditioning, encouraging acceptance of systematic expenditure, are themselves products of identical conditioning processes that eliminated their capacity to recognize the systematic manipulation they implement. The machinery operates through systematic concealment of its own operations, maintaining efficiency through layers of deception that extend to its own administrators. The spiritual weaponization of guilt that transforms Thal's initial refusal into enthusiastic acceptance of systematic expenditure represents one component in larger institutional frameworks that maintain imperial power through systematic application of psychological manipulation disguised as religious instruction. The doctrine that frames cowardice as spiritual failing enables administrative procedures that convert individual resistance into collective compliance through methods that preserve institutional authority while eliminating problematic autonomy. The conditioning session concludes with collective recitation of loyalty oaths that bind processed refusers to systematic expenditure through spiritual commitment rather than simple obedience to orders. The words carry ceremonial weight that transforms administrative procedure into religious sacrament, individual tragedy into cosmic necessity, systematic waste into spiritual achievement that serves purposes beyond human comprehension, but requiring human sacrifice for their fulfillment. The loyalty oaths that bind Thal to systematic expenditure through spiritual commitment create cognitive frameworks that should eliminate any possibility of resistance to imperial authority. But the very intensity of the conditioning process generates its own contradictions. In the shadows between mandatory spiritual sessions and medical rehabilitation, whispered conversations reveal that even the most thorough psychological processing cannot completely eliminate human capacity for recognition of systematic manipulation disguised as divine purpose. The medical orderly who tends Thaler's healing wounds speaks in careful euphemisms that barely conceal forbidden thoughts about the statistical realities of penal legion service. "The Emperor's mercy is infinite," she murmurs, while changing his synth skin bandages, but her eyes carry knowledge that contradicts the spiritual frameworks imposed through mandatory conditioning. But mortal administrators sometimes interpret his will through limited understanding. These subtle expressions of doubt represent dangerous territory in a system designed to eliminate independent moral judgment, but they also reveal the persistent human tendency to seek truth despite institutional pressures that reward ignorance and punish curiosity. The processed refusers who populate rehabilitation facilities gradually develop informal networks of communication that operate below the threshold of official detection while enabling exchange of forbidden observations about their circumstances. The networks emerge spontaneously, despite conditioning designed to prevent collective organization among expendable personnel. Shared meals become opportunities for careful conversation. Medical appointments enable brief contact between individuals from different processing batches. Recreation periods allow subtle exchanges of information that gradually accumulate into comprehensive understanding of systematic deceptions embedded within imperial promises about redemption through service. These underground communications networks operate according to security protocols developed through trial and error by individuals whose survival depends on avoiding detection by commissariat surveillance systems. Conversations occur in coded language that appears to support imperial doctrine while conveying forbidden information about statistical realities. Gestures and expressions communicate complex ideas without verbal statements that monitoring equipment might detect and analyze. The information that flows through these networks gradually reveals systematic patterns that individual processing was designed to conceal. Processed refusers learn that none of their predecessors achieved the redemption promised through penal service. They discover that medical rehabilitation serves preparation for repeated expenditure rather than pathway to restoration. They understand that spiritual conditioning operates through systematic deception rather than authentic religious instruction. But this forbidden knowledge creates psychological crises that the conditioning process did not anticipate or prepare for. Individuals who accepted systematic expenditure through belief in spiritual necessity experience cognitive dissonance when confronted with evidence of institutional deception. Their psychological frameworks cannot accommodate simultaneous acceptance of imperial doctrine and recognition of imperial manipulation without producing mental breakdown that threatens their utility as expendable resources. The coping mechanisms that develop in response to these psychological crises demonstrate human adaptability under circumstances that transcend normal experience. Some processed refusers develop compartmentalized thinking that allows them to function within imperial systems while maintaining private awareness of systematic deception. Others embrace nihilistic acceptance that finds meaning in solidarity with fellow victims, rather than belief in institutional promises. Still others channel their recognition of manipulation into quiet resistance that preserves dignity without threatening institutional authority. The resistance movements that emerge from these informal networks operate according to necessarily limited objectives that avoid direct confrontation with imperial power, while preserving some measure of human agency within circumstances that appear to eliminate all possibility of meaningful choice. They cannot prevent systematic expenditure, but they can ensure that such expenditure occurs with full awareness of its true nature, rather than through acceptance of spiritual deceptions. The forms that quiet resistance takes reflect the constrained circumstances within which it must operate. Processed refusers develop private rituals that maintain personal dignity despite systematic humiliation. They create informal support systems that provide emotional assistance during psychological crises. They preserve memories of their authentic identities despite administrative procedures that reduce them to expendable resources identified by numbers rather than names. These resistance activities require careful concealment from commissaria surveillance systems that monitor processed refusers for signs of systematic organization or ideological deviation. The monitoring operates through human observers, electronic surveillance, and psychological evaluation designed to identify potential threats to institutional authority before they develop into organized opposition. Detection of resistance activities typically results in enhanced processing that eliminates personality while preserving physical utility for continued expendable deployment. The case files documenting enhanced processing procedures reveal systematic methods for eliminating human consciousness while maintaining biological functions necessary for combat operations. Lobotomization techniques preserve motor functions while destroying cognitive capabilities that enable independent thought. Chemical conditioning eliminates emotional responses while maintaining reflexive obedience to simple commands. Surgical modifications replace human neural networks with augmetic systems that ensure perfect compliance with institutional authority. These extreme processing methods serve as deterrent against resistance activities, while providing practical solutions for processed refusers, whose conditioning fails to achieve acceptable compliance levels. The threat of complete personality elimination maintains discipline among expendable personnel, who might otherwise develop problematic independence despite thorough psychological conditioning designed to prevent such developments. But the resistance networks also demonstrate that complete elimination of human agency requires resources that the imperial system cannot allocate efficiently across millions of processed refusers. The monitoring systems operate within budgetary constraints that limit surveillance intensity. The enhanced processing procedures require specialized facilities that cannot accommodate large numbers of subjects. The systematic manipulation depends on psychological techniques that remain vulnerable to human creativity and mutual support. The underground networks that provide Thale with forbidden knowledge about his circumstances operate according to careful risk assessment that balances information sharing against detection probability. The conversations occur during scheduled activities that provide cover for communication. The information transfers use established codes that appear innocuous to casual observation. The network membership remains deliberately limited to individuals whose psychological profiles suggest reliable discretion. Through these careful channels, Thaler learns that his survival of Operation Penitent Flame represents statistical anomaly rather than personal achievement, that his medical rehabilitation prepares him for repeated expenditure rather than pathway to redemption, and that the spiritual conditioning he received operated through systematic deception rather than authentic religious instruction. The knowledge transforms his understanding of his circumstances without providing alternatives to continued compliance with institutional authority. The psychological framework that develops in response to this forbidden knowledge demonstrates human capacity for adaptation under circumstances that transcend normal moral categories. Thaler accepts that he will die through systematic expenditure, while refusing to believe that such death serves spiritual purpose. He complies with institutional requirements while maintaining private recognition of their deceptive nature. He participates in his own systematic expenditure while preserving dignity through awareness of its true character. This psychological adaptation enables survival within circumstances that would otherwise produce complete breakdown. But it also creates internal tensions that cannot be resolved through existing institutional frameworks. The processed refusers who develop such adaptation exist in constant state of cognitive dissonance that requires continuous psychological management to prevent deterioration into dysfunction that would eliminate their utility as expendable resources. The resistance networks that enable this psychological adaptation operate at the margins of imperial tolerance, their activities carefully calibrated to avoid crossing thresholds that would trigger enhanced processing while preserving sufficient human agency to maintain psychological stability among expendable personnel. They represent compromise solutions that serve both individual dignity and institutional requirements through systematic concealment of activities that neither directly challenge nor completely accept imperial authority. The machinery that transformed Thaler from individual refusing service to expendable resource accepting systematic expenditure continues operating through these resistance networks, but their existence demonstrates that complete elimination of human agency thus requires resources beyond institutional capacity, while systematic manipulation depends on psychological techniques that remain vulnerable to human solidarity and mutual recognition of shared circumstances that transcend official narratives about spiritual necessity and redemptive service. The resistance networks that enable psychological survival within systematic expenditure create unintended consequences that imperial planners never anticipated when they designed processing protocols to transform individual refusal into collective compliance. The same cognitive adaptations that allow processed refusers to maintain dignity while accepting systematic expenditure also generate psychological frameworks that question fundamental assumptions underlying imperial authority, creating exactly the ideological resistance that the conditioning process was designed to eliminate. Intelligence analyst Corex reviews surveillance reports from rehabilitation facilities across 17 subsectors, her data slate displaying patterns that reveal systematic failure embedded within institutional success. The processing that successfully converts individual cowardice into willingness to die on command simultaneously produces cognitive frameworks that recognize institutional deception, creating populations of expendable personnel who comply with orders while harboring forbidden knowledge about the systematic manipulation that governs their circumstances. The psychological profiles compiled through continuous monitoring reveal cognitive dissonance levels that exceed normal parameters for processed refusers. Individuals who demonstrate acceptable compliance during mandatory activities show elevated stress indicators suggesting internal conflicts between conditioned responses and rational analysis. Medical evaluations identify physiological markers associated with chronic psychological tension that cannot be resolved through existing institutional frameworks. These indicators suggest that successful processing creates its own systematic problems by producing expendable personnel whose psychological adaptation to systematic expenditure requires cognitive abilities that also enable recognition of institutional deception. The processed refusers who develop sufficient mental resilience to accept repeated deployment in suicidal operations simultaneously develop analytical capabilities that reveal the systematic nature of the manipulation they experience. The case studies that document this phenomenon demonstrate institutional contradiction embedded within imperial policy toward processed refusers. Individual 7734-1138, currently designated for reassignment to Penal Battalion 4471-Beta, shows psychological adaptation patterns that enable continued military utility while harboring analytical frameworks that recognize systematic deception within spiritual conditioning protocols. His compliance operates through conscious choice to preserve dignity rather than unconscious acceptance of institutional authority. Similar patterns appear throughout surveillance data compiled across multiple processing facilities, suggesting systematic generation of ideological resistance through methods designed to eliminate such resistance. The very success of conditioning protocols in producing psychologically resilient, expendable personnel creates populations whose mental capabilities exceed institutional expectations and enable forbidden forms of understanding about their circumstances. The long-term tracking studies that follow processed refusers through multiple deployment cycles reveal escalating psychological sophistication that develops in response to repeated exposure to systematic manipulation. Individuals who survive initial combat assignments demonstrate increasing ability to recognize deceptive frameworks, analyze institutional motivations, and develop private belief systems that provide psychological alternatives to official doctrine. These psychological developments occur despite enhanced conditioning protocols designed to prevent exactly such cognitive sophistication among expendable personnel. The human mind's capacity for adaptation under extreme circumstances proves more resilient than imperial psychological theory predicted, generating unintended consequences that threaten the systematic manipulation required for efficient resource conversion. The most concerning development documented in intelligence files involves the emergence of alternative belief systems that provide spiritual frameworks incompatible with imperial doctrine. Processed refusers who recognize the deceptive nature of official spiritual conditioning begin developing private religious concepts that define systematic expenditure as evil rather than necessary, institutional authority as illegitimate rather than divine, and resistance to imperial power as moral obligation rather than heretical deviation. These alternative belief systems operate through theological inversions that reframe fundamental imperial concepts, according to moral categories that precede imperial conditioning. The emperor becomes symbol of oppression rather than divine authority. Military service becomes spiritual pollution rather than sacred duty. Systematic expenditure of human life becomes cosmic evil rather than necessary sacrifice for higher purpose. The theological sophistication of these alternative frameworks suggests external influence that surveillance systems have failed to detect and eliminate. The processed refusers who develop such beliefs demonstrate understanding of religious concepts that exceed their documented educational backgrounds and contradict their conditioning experiences. Intelligence analysts identify probable contact with heretical organizations that operate sophisticated infiltration networks targeting imperial processing facilities. The investigation protocols that attempt to identify these external influences reveal systematic security failures embedded within processing operations. The isolation procedures designed to prevent ideological contamination among processed refusers create communication networks that enable heretical infiltration. The psychological conditioning that eliminates individual resistance simultaneously eliminates the cognitive frameworks that would recognize and resist heretical indoctrination. The heretical organizations that exploit these systematic vulnerabilities operate according to recruitment strategies specifically designed to target populations whose imperial conditioning has prepared them for ideological conversion. Processed refusers represent ideal recruitment prospects because their psychological adaptation to systematic manipulation has eliminated unconscious loyalty to imperial authority, while preserving analytical capabilities necessary for understanding alternative belief systems. The case documentation reveals sophisticated heretical operations that infiltrate processing facilities through support personnel, medical staff, and spiritual advisors whose credentials appear legitimate but whose loyalties serve powers opposed to imperial authority. These infiltrators provide processed refusers with alternative frameworks for understanding their circumstances, while offering practical assistance for escape attempts that promise liberations from systematic expenditure. The escape networks that develop through heretical infiltration operate according to logistical capabilities that suggest significant external resources and organizational sophistication. Safe houses, transport systems, and identity documentation enable processed refusers to disappear from imperial custody, despite surveillance systems designed to prevent unauthorized departure. The success rates for these escape operations exceed statistical projections based on imperial security protocols. But the intelligence files also reveal that successful escapes often represent recruitment into heretical organizations that employ former processed refusers as assets in operations directed against imperial authority. The individuals who escape systematic expenditure through imperial processing frequently face systematic expenditure through heretical deployment in attacks against imperial installations, creating ironic circularity that serves hostile powers rather than individual liberation. The psychological transformation that enables this recruitment demonstrates systematic failure of imperial conditioning protocols to produce genuine loyalty among processed refusers. The individuals who survive, processing retain sufficient cognitive independence to recognize alternative authorities when such alternatives present themselves, suggesting that systematic manipulation creates resistance to manipulation in general, rather than specific loyalty to imperial institutions. The strategic implications of these developments extend beyond simple security concerns to encompass fundamental questions about the efficiency of converting individual refusal into systematic compliance. The processing that successfully produces expendable personnel for tactical deployment simultaneously produces ideological resistance that serves hostile powers and threatens imperial security through methods that imperial conditioning inadvertently enabled. The resource calculations that measure the cost-effectiveness of processing refusers into expendable personnel must account for these unintended consequences when evaluating institutional efficiency. Each successful conversion of individual cowardice into tactical utility may simultaneously produce future enemy assets whose capabilities exceed those of unprocessed populations due to their systematic exposure to imperial military doctrine and conditioning techniques. The case analysis documenting individual 7734-1138's psychological development illustrates these systematic problems through specific example that demonstrates broader institutional failures. His survival of Operation Penitent Flame provided combat experience that enhanced his military capabilities. His psychological adaptation to systematic expenditure developed analytical skills that enable recognition of institutional deception. His exposure to resistance networks created cognitive frameworks compatible with heretical recruitment. These developments occurred despite successful completion of all prescribed conditioning protocols, suggesting systematic inadequacy in imperial understanding of human psychology under circumstances that transcend normal experience. The machinery that transforms individual refusal into systematic compliance operates according to theoretical frameworks that fail to account for human adaptive capabilities under extreme conditions. The institutional response to these systematic failures demonstrates imperial capacity for acknowledging problems while maintaining the structural inadequacies that generate such problems. Enhanced surveillance, improved security protocols, and modified conditioning procedures address symptoms while preserving the fundamental approach that converts individual resistance into collective compliance through methods that inadvertently enable exactly the ideological resistance they seek to eliminate. The machinery that transformed Thale from individual refusing service to expendable resource accepting systematic expenditure continues operating through systematic recognition of its own failures, but institutional requirements for continuous processing of refusers prevent fundamental modifications that might eliminate the unintended production of enemy assets through successful implementation of procedures designed to serve imperial tactical requirements while creating strategic vulnerabilities that serve hostile powers through methods that imperial conditioning inadvertently enabled. The strategic vulnerabilities that emerge from successful processing operations create institutional requirements for continuous expansion of the machinery that transforms individual resistance into systematic compliance, generating self-perpetuating cycles that ensure the system's eternal operation regardless of its acknowledged failures. Intelligence Analyst Corex's reports flow upward through administrative hierarchies that recognize systematic problems while implementing solutions that require expanded application of identical methods, creating operational imperatives that transcend rational analysis or cost-benefit calculation. The response protocols that address heretical infiltration of processing facilities mandate increased surveillance, enhanced security procedures, and modified conditioning techniques that require additional resources, specialized personnel, and expanded institutional infrastructure. Each solution generates new requirements that demand systematic expansion of the processing apparatus, creating growth imperatives that operate independently of strategic necessity or operational efficiency. But the expanded apparatus produces its own systematic complications through increased populations of processed refusers, whose psychological sophistication develops in response to enhanced conditioning protocols. The more intensive the manipulation, the greater the cognitive capabilities required for psychological survival, creating escalating cycles of institutional sophistication that produce correspondingly sophisticated forms of resistance to institutional authority. The mathematical models that project future resource requirements reveal exponential growth curves that suggest unsustainable institutional expansion within existing imperial administrative frameworks. Current processing operations require 4.7% of sector-level administrative resources. Projected requirements for addressing systematic problems identified through intelligence analysis exceed 23% of available resources within the next standard decade, creating allocation pressures that threaten other essential imperial functions. These projections assume successful implementation of enhanced protocols without accounting for probable resistance escalation that historical patterns suggest will emerge in response to intensified conditioning procedures. The processing that successfully converts individual cowardice into tactical utility, while inadvertently producing ideological resistance, may require systematic resources that exceed the strategic value of the expendable personnel such processing generates. The bureaucratic momentum that drives continued expansion of processing operations operates according to institutional logic that prioritizes internal consistency over strategic effectiveness. Administrative systems that have evolved to manage systematic conversion of refusal into compliance cannot acknowledge fundamental inadequacies without undermining their own operational frameworks, creating organizational imperatives that maintain problematic policies despite documented evidence of systematic failure. The case review that determines Individual 7734-1138's reassignment operates within these systematic constraints, processing his psychological development according to established protocols that classify ideological sophistication as requiring enhanced surveillance, rather than questioning the methods that produced such sophistication. The administrative machinery continues functioning through systematic recognition of problems, while implementing solutions that perpetuate the underlying causes of such problems. Thale receives orders for deployment with Penal Battalion 4471-Beta through channels that demonstrate perfect bureaucratic efficiency applied to systematic waste of human resources. His transport assignment, equipment allocation, and tactical deployment follow standardized procedures that have been refined through statistical analysis of millions of previous cases, creating operational effectiveness that serves institutional requirements while ignoring strategic consequences. The transport facility that processes his departure from rehabilitation demonstrates the systematic expansion that characterizes imperial response to acknowledged inadequacies. New security checkpoints, enhanced surveillance systems, and modified personnel protocols create administrative complexity that requires additional staff, expanded facilities, and increased resource allocation while processing identical numbers of expendable personnel through methods that generate identical systematic problems. The loading procedures that place Thale aboard transport designation Emperor's Mercy operate according to systematic precision that treats individual human beings as logistical components in calculations that have achieved perfect administrative efficiency. His assignment to Cargo Hold 7, position 1138, reduces his individual identity to spatial coordinates within transportation systems that process human resources according to the same principles that govern ammunition distribution or fuel allocation. But the systematic efficiency that characterizes these procedures conceals operational realities that demonstrate fundamental contradictions embedded within institutional success. The processed refusers who comply with loading procedures maintain psychological frameworks that recognize systematic deception while accepting systematic expenditure, creating populations of expendable personnel whose cognitive sophistication exceeds institutional expectations and enables forms of resistance that operate below administrative detection thresholds. The transport corridors where Thale moves toward his cargo hold assignment carry whispered conversations that demonstrate continued operation of resistance networks, despite enhanced security protocols designed to eliminate such networks. The coded language, subtle gestures, and careful timing that enable information exchange operate according to security procedures that have evolved in response to surveillance systems, creating escalating cycles of institutional sophistication that produce correspondingly sophisticated forms of organized resistance. The administrative reports that document transport security identify communication patterns that suggest systematic organization among expendable personnel, but the response protocols mandate additional surveillance rather than questioning the institutional methods that create populations capable of such organization. The machinery operates through systematic acknowledgement of its own systematic inadequacies while implementing solutions that require expansion of identical methods. The cargo hold where Thale takes his assigned position contains 847 other processed refusers, whose individual stories demonstrate identical patterns of institutional success that produces unintended consequences threatening institutional security. Each represents successful conversion of individual resistance into systematic compliance through methods that simultaneously develop cognitive capabilities that enable recognition of institutional deception and compatibility with heretical recruitment. The collective psychological profile of Cargo Hold 7 represents concentrated example of systematic problems that characterize the entire processing apparatus. These individuals demonstrate acceptable compliance with orders while harboring analytical frameworks that question institutional authority, creating internal contradictions that cannot be resolved through existing conditioning protocols without eliminating the psychological resilience that enables their tactical utility. The transport departure procedures that initiate their journey toward theater designation. Mortis 7 operate according to scheduling requirements that treat human cargo as renewable resource, requiring regular replacement through continuous processing operations. The systematic efficiency that governs these procedures demonstrates perfect institutional function applied to systematic waste that generates strategic vulnerabilities exceeding the tactical benefits such waste produces. The orbital trajectories that carry Transport Emperor's Mercy toward its destination pass other vessels engaged in identical missions, transports carrying processed refusers toward systematic expenditure, cargo ships returning empty holds for refilling, administrative vessels coordinating the logistical networks that maintain continuous operation of machinery designed to convert individual resistance into collective compliance through methods that ensure its own eternal perpetuation. The systematic patterns visible from orbital perspective reveal the true scale of operations that have evolved to process individual human decisions into institutional utility. The transport networks, processing facilities, and deployment systems create infrastructure that operates with industrial efficiency to transform human resistance into tactical resources while generating systematic complications that require expanded application of identical methods. The communication frequencies that connect transport operations to administrative headquarters carry continuous streams of data that document perfect institutional function applied to acknowledged institutional failure. Casualty reports, replacement requisitions, and deployment schedules flow through channels that maintain operational efficiency while recognizing systematic problems that threaten strategic effectiveness. But the administrative responses to these systematic problems operate according to bureaucratic logic that cannot acknowledge fundamental inadequacies without undermining institutional frameworks that define imperial civilization itself. The machinery that transforms individual refusal into systematic compliance represents essential component of imperial power that must continue operating regardless of its documented tendency to produce strategic vulnerabilities through tactical successes. The eternal engine that processes Thais and millions like him operates through systematic recognition of its own systematic failures, while implementing solutions that ensure continued expansion of operations that generate identical problems, requiring identical solutions in perpetual cycles that transcend rational analysis or strategic effectiveness. The machinery continues functioning through perfect institutional logic applied to systematic waste that serves essential requirements for maintaining imperial power through methods that ensure its own eternal operation. The transport burns through the warp toward destinations that will consume its human cargo through systematic expenditure that produces tactical utility while generating strategic complications requiring continuous processing of replacement personnel through identical methods. The engine turns, the machinery operates, the system perpetuates itself through perfect efficiency applied to acknowledged inadequacy, creating eternal cycles that ensure continued transformation of individual resistance into institutional compliance through methods that guarantee their own endless repetition. The iron brand that marked Thale as coward becomes symbol of systematic success that produces systematic failure, individual punishment that enables collective resistance, institutional efficiency that generates institutional vulnerability. The Aquila Inversa burns eternal, marking those who refuse to fight as resources requiring processing through machinery that operates with perfect precision to serve requirements that transcend individual choice while ensuring that such choice continues generating the resistance necessary for the system's continued operation through eternal cycles of systematic conversion applied to renewable human resources, whose refusal enables their systematic expenditure in service to institutions that depend on continuous processing of resistance into compliance through methods that ensure their own perpetual necessity.